Um, got a few things to go through tonight. And so broadcasting live from home because we have heat out in the classroom back in Huntsville and live. So we're all on Zoom this evening. And going into our final class session of the first module, so class session 1.5, and we're going to visit a new chapter in the fifth discipline called Mental Models, which is another one of the five disciplines of a learning organization. So, the fifth discipline, the book, is about the art of the learning organization. And to have a learning organization, the author Peter Senge said we need to have five disciplines. And up until this point, we've talked about one of the five disciplines, which is systems thinking. And last week we looked at systems diagrams and systems archetypes. That's all part of systems thinking. And then another discipline that we'll touch on some today is mental models. And then we'll look at some examples of some business and strategy and leadership mental models um, in the forms of a couple of books that didn't necessarily assign as required. I think I put them as optional in case you just like that kind of thing. Good to Great, How the Mighty Fall. We'll also look at one of the required books and start looking into it a little more. And that is When They Win, You Win. So that's kind of what's ahead of us today. But the fact that today is the last class session of the first module means we're coming up on some due dates. So first we'll jump to the project. Hopefully everybody has gotten well into meeting with your projects and gotten on the Miro boards. It takes a minute to figure that out. So hopefully you've been playing around with that and meeting as teams. I haven't had a chance to follow up a whole lot to see what people are doing, but this does really require consistent engagement to do a good job. Like I said, on the Miro board, there are times you can meet as a team. You can have it to where individuals can go into the board on their own and contribute and collaborate. That's kind of why I use that tool. So now we actually had a question before I started recording. So phase one is due on February 18th, right? It's about 2 weeks. One thing that I do try to offer is if you turn in your assignment a week early, and I mean turn in the completed assignment, I will give you feedback and grade it, and then you can resubmit it by the due date and earn up to half the points that you missed. So I'll go ahead and grade it. And so if you get an 80, then you can earn up to 20 of those missed points back and get a 90. Whereas if you had turned that same thing in on the due date, you would have only gotten an 80. So if you only turn part of it in a week early and say, Nick, tell us where we're at, I will grade it the way it is. So if you're not completely done by the 11th, don't turn it in unless you want a grade on your partial assignment. Just so I do want to clarify that it is not for me to give you feedback on very little that you've done. It is to, if you've gotten it a week early, complete to the point you would have turned it in. And so look at the rubric, see everything that I'm going to grade it by. And if you want to turn it in, I'll be happy to give you feedback so that you can resubmit to earn up some of those points back. So part of the assignment, there's what you're going to do and execute in the tools and things that you're going to have on Miro, the create tools and all of that, the yellow cards. But then there's also a requirement for a narrative and reflection. So what am I looking for there? I'm looking for kind of a running story of what you and what your team did and what you experienced and what you learned. So I'm not necessarily looking for a summary of what you did. In other words, I'm not really looking for you to repeat the assignment to me and say, we used these tools, came up with ideas, used the yellow cards, and down select it. I need to know that's what you did. That was what the assignment was. What I'm looking for is for you to say, we got together as a team. We used these create tools. What we learned from that was our experience was, oh, we came up with more ideas than we expected, or this was silly, or what did you experience? What was the team thinking? How did you go about executing the project? That's what I'm looking for. Tell me the story of what you've done. And also, if you haven't named your team something other than Team 7 or 6 or whatever, please do so. It's a little harder for me to navigate when I don't have specific team names. And why would you not have a fun team name? Like you're not gonna have a lot of more opportunities in life to have fun, so take it in this class and have a fun team name. Um, so that's the project. Any questions on the project before I move on to the exam? Okay. So the first exam is going to be next week, on the 11th. So that will be, so I think all of y'all have had me by now for EM 660. So the exams will kind of follow the same type approach. The 20 available 24 hours. You can go in during that 24-hour period and take the exam. Once you begin, you'll have 90 minutes to complete the exam unless you have provided me with additional accommodations that you've been granted, and then I try to moderate those through Canvas. Um, it'll be about 20 questions or so worth 100 points. So very similar to EM 660. About 70% of the questions I try to be kind of straightforward C questions, another 15% B type questions, which are a little more conceptual, requires a little more thought, and another 15% that are A questions, which are kind of critical thinking type um, questions where you read a passage, you might have to think and stare at a couple of options that both could seem somewhat right and make a choice. The difference in this, I want to go ahead and give you a heads up, is there will be one open answer question. So, and that will be, I will give you a scenario and I will want you to create a systems diagram. So, like the stuff that we talked about last week. Um, and that's what I will be looking for on that. So let me see if I can show a little more. So you'll have 90 minutes to take the exam. What I'm going to try to do is the systems diagram can be uploaded outside of that 90 minutes. So I won't necessarily make you create one during the exam. Um, so for those of you that watch the video ahead of time or live, you will actually hear that and realize you don't have to create the diagram as part of the exam. You can do it um, afterwards and upload it. Um, I believe you'll be able to, there is a comments section, I believe, um, that you will be able to add it to. I'm just looking. Um,
Hey, question.
yes.
You saw some of the formats, I guess, some people put in. Is kind of sketching it on a pad and taking a photo of it and uploading it okay? Or do you want it kind of,
Yeah.
you saw the way I did it, so
Yeah. I'm fine with that.
okay.
I would rather you spend your time trying to make it capture what you're trying to communicate than trying to make it look a certain way.
There was a few revisions, that's all. So it was, I just ended up finding it easy to draw it.
Yeah, yeah, and I'm the same. Like, there's something about putting pen to paper sometime that um, hopefully there'll be, and y'all can tell me, and people have done it before, something like this that you can attach it to. Um, and so just a heads up on that. Otherwise, mostly multiple choice. Otherwise, kind of similar to what you've seen with me in other classes. So any questions on the exam at all? Okay, awesome. So we're going to talk about mental models today, and we're going to talk about some of the other books that we've been discussing. So last week, we kind of, when we introduced the systems thinking diagrams and archetypes, we said it's to try to help us see how things are interrelated out there. In other words, try to transition from seeing things in terms of independent, unrelated, linear events and start to understand that they have more circular effect, causal feedbacks. We looked at reinforcing loops last week. We looked at balancing loops. That there's certain things that cause those events that are consistent patterns of behavior. And then if we look even further, those are interacting with each other to have some kind of underlying systemic structure that leads to the patterns of events, that leads, or patterns of behavior that leads to the events. But all of those, to some degree, all the way down at the bottom of the iceberg, are formed by mental models. So, what are mental models? They're assumptions, whether it be conscious or unconscious, that we have that kind of shape the way we see the world. And very often we don't even realize that we have them, but they're the way our brain. One of my colleagues, and some of y'all may have had her, Dr. Vager, one of our other engineering management professors. She has a psychology background, and she always says our brain is lazy. So what our brain is always looking to do is take shortcuts by generalizing, and mental models is a way of doing that. So based on our culture, our experiences, our upbringings, whatever it may be, we have these certain ways that we see the world that are formed that, whether we realize it or not, often drive our behaviors, and our decision making. So this will be really curious. This is always fun for me. Some examples of beliefs or drivers. So here in the US, this is interesting. Um, Does anybody associate the color blue and the color pink with certain genders? I see some thumbs up on that. I'm not in person to see heads nodding or people pretending that they don't. Um, but it's a very common thing. Now, for those of you not from the US, is that the case where you're from in your country, that blue is often associated with boys and pink with girls?
Yes.
Is it that way as well in Australia?
Yeah,
Yes.
you're all the same. Yeah.
Okay, interesting. In Iran as well. So sometime we someone chose a color, not even sure why, and that formed a mental model of what we associate that. And sometimes I'm not even questioning it. That's just the way it was. Then I had someone inform me last year. Um, who I very much respect. And she said, that wasn't, and she's from India. And she said, we don't have that where I'm from. But then she also said, you realize that wasn't even a thing in the US till after World War II. And it actually used to be the opposite. I was like, huh, interesting. It was a marketing thing. So sometimes, and that kind of goes with what we're going to talk about tonight with mental models is one, let's stop and understand the ones that we have, whatever they are. And then two, part of it is also questioning those mental models. How accurate are they? And what are they grounded in? And how might they be reframed if needed to drive better decision making? And just be conscious of them to begin with is something that's important. So, some different mental models. We talked about in EM 660 the idea of servant leadership. And so there's two different mental models that could come from being in the role of a leader. One of them is I view leadership as come to me and report. I'm at the top of the organizational chart. You bring what you've done to me, report it, and then another mental model of being a leader is I'm your manager, your supervisor. I'm going to come to where you're doing the work to see how I can support you. Same role, manager, two different mental models of what the responsibilities of that manager are and how that could probably drive different behaviors and decision making. When we talked about in EM 660, um, theory X versus theory Y assumptions from Douglas McGregor. Those are two different assumptions. Those are mental models, with a theory X being workers are lazy. And so I'm going to go about my job as a manager with that assumption. And theory Y said, I have the assumption people want to contribute, and I'm going to carry myself in a different way as a manager because those are my assumptions, my mental models of how things work. Um, so being aware of our mental models is important. And then also, we're going to revisit mental models in the last module, module three, when we get into strategic leadership and we talk about emotional intelligence at a pretty detailed level. And part of self-awareness, one of the major dimensions of emotional intelligence is understanding your mental models. And so having an idea what those things are that are a frame of reference that have a strong influence on how we see the world. And so, been doing for the last 2 or 3 years some emotional intelligence for leaders training. And this is one, and I cover this same thing with mental models and self-awareness. And I always put this on here, emotional intelligence for leaders. I'm doing this training as part of emotional intelligence. So one of the mental models is I am a male who grew up in the Southeast United States. So what do you think my mental model growing up of what emotions are might have been? That I wasn't supposed to have them, and they were a sign of weakness. Not that that is accurate at all, and so but that was kind of ingrained in you. You're tough. You don't show emotions, and um, to quite an unhealthy degree. And so being able to, one, understand where that mental model came from, the environment that shaped it, but then two, being able to question it, reframe it in a way that is a little more, that can hopefully make me a little more effective as a contributing manager, an individual, is part of what I wanted to discuss today. So, in the fifth discipline in the chapter on mental models, the author Peter Senge introduces some different tools for reflection and inquiry that can be used to better understand mental models. And we'll touch on a couple, but we'll revisit them later in the semester as well when we talk about uh, some of the other disciplines. One of them is to understand and recognize when you are making leaps of abstraction. And so leaps of abstraction are when we go from a direct observation of one thing and my brain tries to generalize that into some um, broader umbrella that gets associated with us. Like I said, our brain is lazy, so anytime it gets the opportunity to take a specific instance and throw it into oh, this is what always happens, that's a leap of abstraction. So, um, I always used to say when I was working with companies that problems are very rarely, if ever, solved from the meeting room. In other words, I would sit in meeting rooms with management and they would put on the screen these nice charts and spreadsheets of issues that they were having in their organization. And they would sit and start to blame and make assumptions. Well, I think that happened because, or when that happens, it's usually because. And you start to hear those words that are leaps of abstraction that are associating things from the past and taking specific today instances and generalizing them. And I would always say, you don't know why this one happened. You are making the assumption when that this is what usually happens. Go see what is occurring right now, because our brain does try to generalize things. A tool that we're going to investigate in the third module, but I'll go ahead and introduce it here because the fifth discipline introduces it as a tool of reflection and inquiry, is exposing the left-hand column. And the left-hand column is a tool that allows us to reflect on discussions that we've had and compare what we actually heard and said versus what we were thinking and feeling at that same time. So we have one column, the right-hand column, which is where we try to recollect just the factual. Here's what I said. Here's what they said. Here's what I said. Here's what they said. This is what was actually being heard and spoken. And then in the left-hand column, you say, okay, when this part of the conversation was being said and being heard, here's actually what I was really thinking and feeling during that same time. And it helps you to better understand where your mind is, where your brain was, what your feelings were. Um, and a lot of times that's more accurate of a reflection than what was actually being said and heard. But even understanding the difference is critical. And another tool for reflection and inquiry that can help us with our mental models is developing the skill to be able to balance advocacy and inquiry. And this is where we really start to push ourselves to question our mental models, to be open to adjusting them and reframing them based on evidence as it might be presented to us. So, advocacy is being the willingness to stand up for my beliefs and my opinions and my views on a certain matter. I'm going to advocate for this view because I strongly believe in it. Inquiry is the willingness to openly listen to other people's views with genuine curiosity and an open mind to adjust your views if they present evidence that suggests that their views might be a little more accurate than your own. And so, multiple years later, after been talking about for all this time that I've used the fifth discipline in my classes, and I've talked about balancing advocacy and inquiry, and I was right at a year ago, I was at a AI symposium and actually served on a panel, which is laughable if you know me, because I don't know anything about AI. But I was on a panel about its use in industry, and opportunities for it. And so there was a dinner afterwards, and I was talking to one of my colleagues, and they brought up this term intellectual humility. And that was new to me. I was like, oh, never heard of it. But then when it was explained to me, I was like, oh, that sounds like balancing advocacy and inquiry. And I'll touch on what intellectual humility is in a moment. And then the other tool for reflection and inquiry is to better understand our mental models, is to face the difference and be honest with our espoused theory versus theory in use. So our espoused theory is what I say I believe, and my theory in use is how I actually act. And resolving those into being the same thing by doing one of two things: changing the way I act to better align with my espoused theory. So changing my theory and use, changing the way I act to better align with what I say I believe, my espoused theory, or changing what I say I believe, changing my espoused theory to be better in line with my theory and use, or the way I act. And so all of those are tools that the fifth discipline introduces us to that can help us better understand our mental models. And so when I started diving into this thing called intellectual humility, it was fascinating to me because I like learning new stuff, especially about psychology. And it really was just another way of talking about balancing advocacy and inquiry. So intellectual humility is being open to embracing your limits of knowledge, being secure with that, separate your ideas from your identity. Realize that you are, especially with politics here in the United States, it fascinates me how a vast majority of the population will align themselves with one of two of the major parties and blindly go along with them for it, like they're rooting for them like a sports team. And not questioning either of the beliefs, and very often have beliefs that some fall along with one and some fall along with the other, but very often they'll take the ideas from a movement and make that their own identity. I am a Republican, I am a Democrat. Um, and so being able to separate ideas from identities, a sign of um, intellectual humility, having respect for other people's views, even if you don't um, agree with them, and being open to entertaining and revising your own beliefs given that new evidence exists. So, intellectual arrogance is being so stuck in your ways that you're never going to change no matter what's being said. Or if you don't advocate for anything and you're going to change based on whoever the most recent person you talked to's views were and let them convince you that they're right, then that's called being gullible. But somewhere in the middle where you can balance that is intellectual humility. And so um, when I heard that in conversation, I found it to be an interesting term. But it's kind of reflects what we were talking about with um, what the fifth discipline calls the skill of balancing advocacy and inquiry. So the key in strategic management and strategic thinking is to understand that we have mental models, understanding that if we stop and think about them, reflect on them, can expose assumptions that we have about the world, about our organization, about people that we might not have even realized we had. Then use our tools that the fifth discipline suggests um, for reflection and inquiry to better understand our mental models and to be open to entertaining evidence that might suggest we can reframe them in different ways, and that will help us better strategically plan and strategically lead. And so that's kind of a overview of the chapter in the fifth discipline, on mental models. I won't cover the whole thing. That's part of your reading. But what I wanted to introduce for the rest of the class were some things that the other books that will reference in class or use talk about with mental models. So the first one being the book Getting the Right Things Done, which will you should have already started reading if we follow the readings for each class period. And we'll start talking about that more in module two. But Getting the Right Things Done is about a Atlas Industries and their manufacturing company. And this is again, and this book is in a novel form, so it's using a fictional story to demonstrate management and strategy principles. And so the company was on the brink of selling, but they decide to try and resurrect, and they've hired a new COO that's come in that's trying to introduce the strategic planning process. And their new COO, John Karros, said transformations most often fail because people have the wrong mental models. And so it talks about conventional mental models versus, in the book, the thought process is based off of the lean systems, the Toyota system, and the mental models that that system has that are a little counter to some of the traditional leadership principles. And so, um, kind of some of the ones I mentioned before, when I said problems aren't saw from a meeting room. The old way of thinking was only the grunts go to the floor, whereas the mental model is let's go see the problems for ourselves and go support the people on the floor. One of the biggest differences is our view on problems. The traditional management mental model may have been not to admit that there's problems, hide problems to avoid getting in trouble, or having not feeling comfortable. If I admit that there's problems, if there's issues with something that I'm in charge of, then that means that I'm not doing a good job. Whereas a different way to look at that, a different mental model would be that, to view that problems are opportunities and we want to make them visible because they exist, whether we acknowledge them or not. And our mental model is to celebrate when problems are surfaced so that we can openly address them and solve them at the root cause. And so it discusses different mental models, with the point being from the character John Karros, who's introduced in Getting the Right Things Done, as he's talking to the management team at the organization that he's been brought into, is we have to change the way we think as leaders if we're going to adopt this new style to try to improve the way our organization functions. We have to adjust our mental models. So it touches on it. I'm going to spend a little bit of time introducing you as well to, so Getting the Right Things Done is the second book that was required. And the third one is When They Win, You Win by Russ Laraway, which I've really enjoyed getting to learn over the last 3 years or so. Um, and if you like Radical Candor, I think you'll like this, possibly even more. I consider this one of the better books on leadership and management that I've been exposed to in quite a while. And he presents a mental model, whether he calls it that or not. I think for manager effectiveness. And so the whole book is about how to be a great manager. And he says it's so easy. The whole job of a manager is to deliver aligned results and then make sure that your people on your team are successful. That's it. And so he presents the mental model for how to do that effectively. And it's what he calls the big three, which leads to engagement, which leads to results. So I need to deliver an aligned result that comes from employee engagement. And he calls something the big three skills that can lead to engagement. So why is engagement important? And so the book opens up in the intro and in chapters, I think one and two, where talking about the whole purpose of why this E in this model is important to begin with. Why engagement? And I think we touched on this a little bit if you were in my EM 660 class, whether it be last semester or last year or whenever it was, when we introduced workplace motivation and why it's important. Gallup Global Workforce Report from across the world said companies in the top quartile of employee engagement perform better. 17% more productive, 21% more profitable than companies not in the top quartile. So results are better for companies who have higher employee engagement. Then some shocking numbers. Globally, of employees surveyed, only 15% were fully engaged at work. This was self-reported. Only 15%. Another 35 or so percent reported not being engaged. Actually, no, I think 35. I'll jump to the US numbers. Those are the ones I know. In the US, the 15% fully engaged was actually more. It was 33%. So a third of the workforce is fully engaged. Here's the scary part. 17 of the percent of that same um, survey was actively not engaged at work. And so the middle 50% were not engaged, but not trying to be um, blatant about it. And that's what, and I believe the kids call these days quiet quitting. So engagement is important, leads to higher productivity, more profit, and a low percentage of employees are reporting high engagement with their organizations. Here's something even more eye-opening. And in When They When You Win, he discusses this research in a little more detail. And he says of engagement, 70% of the variance in the statistical analysis of engagement can be accounted for by management. In other words, us as managers are by far the single biggest factor in the degree to which employees are engaged with the organization. That's how important it is to be an effective manager and a good leader. Because if we can develop those skills, it leads to greater engagement from our people, which leads to greater results and a more fulfilling workplace. So that's kind of where the premise of the book, what it's centered around, is the importance of employee engagement. And then what our role as managers are to increase the chances of that engagement happening with each member of our team so that we can together work toward getting key results. And he even goes into what do they mean by engagement, and even talks about some measurement tools that he developed throughout his career at different places. So Russ Laraway's worked at Google, at Twitter, at Qualtrics. He was in the Marines. He was an officer in the Marines. So a history of leadership. And he talks about um, tools that have been developed to measure engagement. But what are we really talking about with engagement? Can we measure from an employee standpoint how fulfilled they are by the work that they do? How willing they are to give extra effort? How proud are they? What kind of pride do they have in working for their employer? Employee satisfaction, net promoter score. How likely are you to say, hey, this place that I work, how likely are you to refer your employer to someone else as a place to work? That's an indicator of engagement. And what is your intent to stay or leave? All those are measures that we can do to ultimately understand employee engagement. And so the big three from when they win, you win. The three management skills that we can work on, and the book gives us tools and tricks and techniques to develop to be more effective managers, the ability to give direction, which we will jump right into in module two, because it'll be part of our strategic planning process. Um, Part of giving direction is being able to provide the long-term components, vision, mission, and then also what are our objectives and key results? In other words, what are we going to do and how are we going to know we're successful? Um, Working toward our, as we execute our mission, working toward our vision. And that's all part of the strategic planning process. And that's part of giving direction, which is one of the big three skills of being an effective manager. So we'll get into that in the next module, probably in the next class, actually. We'll start introducing at least the vision and mission part of it. Then another skill is coaching. And coaching is kind of going back to radical candor in a lot of ways. It's being able to effectively develop people to continue doing what they do well and improve what they can do better on. In other words, giving criticism and praise in an effective way to where people can improve, but then also continue to be better at what they're doing well. And how do we communicate that? And then the third part is how do we help people develop throughout their career? So we'll really get into some good stuff. That's probably my favorite part of the book and the most eye-opening was as far as something new that I learned a few years ago when I dove into this book. How do we not only say we care about people on our team as humans, but what are some things we can do to actually develop them as people, as employees? And so those are the big three that the When They Win, You Win book has as part of the model. So if we develop our skills as a manager in giving direction, in coaching, in developing our team members and through their career, that should lead to more engagement from our employees, which should lead to greater results. So that's what the mental model for manager effectiveness is, which is the big three, leads to engagement, which leads to results. So that's what we'll learn. And when they win, you win. So I am presenting that as an example of a mental model. And then the other two mental models that I want to cover in terms of competitiveness and strategy come from a couple of books by a gentleman named Jim Collins, who was a researcher at Stanford. And he put a book out um, about a quarter century ago in 2000 called Good to Great. And then a follow-up book about 7, 8 years later, maybe 10 years later, called How the Mighty Fall. And I want to cover two frameworks, two mental models, I'll call them, from that book, from those two books. And I shared some readings. Like I said, I didn't require these two books. I think they're great to have in your collection. They really changed my mind of how I view organizations. Um, But I shared some ratings to give you a summary of each one, but I do recommend, if you really do care about the subject matter, they're two good ones to add to your collection. Um, so um, I used to have a top dog strategy tip for each class and use my dog Daisy to share um, different strategy tips. And I think I said at the beginning of the semester, unfortunately, Daisy passed away over the holidays after 12 amazing years. But if you've ever been around, Daisy was an English bulldog. And if you've ever been around that breed of dog, they all have a certain personality trait that basically thinks that if you've ever seen the evolutionary chart, bulldogs think they're the next step of evolution beyond human. In other words, they carry themselves with this attitude of, I've achieved this level of evolution. You're just waiting to evolve as far as I am. And they carry themselves with that. So I always use that to introduce um, this topic of good to great. Um, but Good to Great was published in 2001. And it was an interesting, so the premise of the book was the research team basically said, we want to know why some companies achieve a level of greatness while other ones do not. And so a couple of disclaimers on this. One, they only studied US companies. Um, from the inception of the Fortune 500 up until the publication of the book. And so they studied every company to date at that time that had made the Fortune 500. So there was over 1,400 organizations at the time in a hope to identify patterns that were similar, that they could identify these are things that make companies great versus not. And one of the taglines in the book was the enemy of great is not bad, the enemy of great is good. So some companies get to good and never make that jump, while some companies did not. So they had the other disclaimer is they had a very specific way of how they defined what, quote, great meant. And they basically looked for companies who had a 15-year cumulative stock return below the general market. So if you just think of in the US NASDAQ standards, the S&P 500 or something, which is kind of just the average market return, um, and then followed by some transition point, followed by an immediate 15 years of cumulative returns of at least three times the general market. So that's how they defined. If a company did that, then they had some era of greatness that we want to study and learn more about. And so what they found was there were some industries during certain amount times where everybody made a big jump. And so they kind of threw those out and said if it was independent of industry, there's actually only 11 of those 1,400, over 1,400 companies that met this criteria of 15 years of average or below average stock returns, followed by 15 years of cumulative returns of 300% of the general market. So then they compared each of those 11 great companies to a good company in their same industry. So a comparison company. So there's a company that made the jump and someone in their same industry during the same time frame who didn't, and they tried to study the differences in those and also try to identify commonalities between those 11 companies during their period of greatness. And so based on that research, the Good to Great team formulated a seven-piece framework that says these are all things that the great companies had in common. So this is the good to great framework. So these were the companies during that time or during their research these are the 11 companies and the years during which they had their quote era of greatness. So what I think is very important to emphasize here is there you will see names on this list who no longer exist or such small organizations that you wouldn't consider them great. And the point is, the book is not these companies are great. It was there was something going on during this period of 15 years that they had this level of return that made them great. What did all these companies have in common? With the same point being, if they stop doing those things, they will likely cease to be great. So it is about not about the company, but the framework that was made up, um, that made up those companies. And so I provided the list and the comparison companies here. And here is the 7 stage framework from good to great. So I wanted to go through and just kind of give an overview of each of those. But they said, here's the 7 things that each of the great companies had in common, and they broke it down into 3 categories. There are 2 pieces of the framework that had disciplined people, 2 disciplined thought, and 2 on disciplined action. And then the 7th piece is the concept of the flywheel. So I want to talk about each one of those. One of which we discussed in EM 660, which is the concept of the level 5 leader. So the level 5 leader, which they found out that all 11 companies had someone who fit this criteria during their era of greatness, was the in juxtaposition of a level 4 leader, which traditionally, a lot of times, we're taught to think this is what a leader is supposed to look like. So a level 4 leader is often very brash, egotistical, have a big name, and they come in to save the day. And so it talked about how a lot of organizations would go and recruit and bring in these big name CEOs thinking it was that one person that was going to save the day. And all of the great companies had someone who was more humble and tended to look out the window when there was credit to be given, and in the mirror when blame was to be placed. So a level 5 leader would give credit when there was success to other people and take the blame, look in the mirror when something bad happened, whereas a level 4 leader was more likely to look out the mirror or look in the mirror when there's credit. Hey, I'm the reason that we succeeded, not my people. And look out the window and to blame everyone else when something bad happened. So the concept of level 5 leadership came from the term was coined from the book Good to Great. And so one of the things that he talked about um, was humble doesn't mean weak. Um, so they don't boast, but then they make strong um, decisions with resolve when needed. And he talks about some of the different ones in the book and in some of the readings that I gave you. But the one of the takeaways that always stood out to me was when he introduced this framework and was asked, "Hey, if these level 5 leaders, if all 11 of these companies had someone that fit this criteria, are they just hard to find? Because the majority of our leaders tend to be these level 4 type personalities." And his point was, no, it's not that there's not many level 5 people. It's that what we have traditionally been taught to look for in a leader is these characteristics of the level 4 leaders. And so we overlook the level 5. So I use this image because we only see what we're looking for. And if we're given this mental model of what a leader is supposed to look like, and we're told, look for a vase in this picture, then that's what we're going to see. But if we're presented with a different mental model that says this is not a vase or a candlestick holder, this is actually 2 faces looking at each other. And maybe that's what leaders look like. And so then we have to learn to start to look at different characteristics to be able to entertain that people might even be um, candidates for leadership positions. So, really interesting concept there. So, the first component of good to great, the Good to Great framework was level five leadership. And then the second component was the concept of first who and then what. So he talked about how do we um, have the right people in our organization, whereas it's very often a fallacy. He said most companies will repeat this phrase, people are our most important asset. And he said that's really the wrong way to look at it. You should look at it as the right people are our most important asset. And all of the great companies had an approach to where they would try to get the right people in the organization first and then get them in the right roles. And so the way he described it was getting the right people on the bus, getting the wrong people off the bus before you decide where you're going to go. And then part of that too is when you get the right people on the bus, then you still need to find the right seats for them. Maybe they're in the wrong seat, maybe they're in the wrong role, and you need to get them in the right role as well. And the great companies all had that approach to their personnel. Um, One of the examples he used, one of the great companies was Nucor Steel. And at the time, a lot of the steel industry in the US was in the Pittsburgh area. Um, and then Nucor Steel started in Nebraska, right in the middle of corn farming country. And and the point that Nucor had was we would rather take someone with a farmer's work ethic and teach them how to make steel than to try to take someone in the traditional industry. And so getting the right people, if you just give us the right people, we can develop them with the right knowledge and skills to be successful. And that's more important sometimes than just having experience in a specific area um, without having necessarily the work ethic. So getting the right people on the bus, getting them in the right seat. Good to Great said all of the 11 companies tended to have that mindset toward their people. And this one goes along with mental models a lot of as well. Component three to the Good to Great framework was confront the brutal facts, yet never lose faith. Confront the brutal facts. So this is kind of goes along with that same mental model that's discussed in getting the right things done, which is how do we view problems? Do we view them as something we need to hide? Or do we view problems as opportunities that we want to uncover? And so, um, for practices that they talk about that the great companies did, they tried to lead with questions when problems happen, not jump to answers, engage in dialogue to fully understand what happened, conduct autopsies. In other words, when problems happen, they ask why they happen, not who did it, and trying to blame so that they could try to solve problems at the root cause. And they tended to put their best people, the great companies tended to have um, their best people work on proactive um, things, whereas the good companies tended to have their best um, people fixing things and not working proactively. Um, the example that he used was um, a rock with worms under it. And I grew up in the country and on a farm. We had a pond because we raised cattle, and so um, we would we had a pond that they would drink out of and bathe in and just chill in, and we would fish all the time. And so one of the things we'd always fish with is worms. We would always be looking for worms to put on our hook and go and fish. And a good place to find worms is under big rocks. and especially after it's rained, because worms try to find cool places, damp places to hang out. And in Good to Great, he said, um, confronting the brutal facts, think of it as the willingness to pick up the rock and turn it over to expose the problems, because the worms are under the rock whether you pick the rock up or not. So having that culture of exposing problems. So he discusses the Stockdale paradox. And so Admiral Stockdale, who was the highest ranking U.S. officer who was held as a prisoner of war during the Vietnam War, and he happened to work on the Stanford campus, across the campus from Jim Collins, who wrote Good to Great. And so he interviewed him about how difficult it was being a prisoner of war and how he managed that. Because Admiral Stockdale was not only known for surviving multiple tortures, but also developing systems that helped other prisoners of war endure torture and survive, whether it be different types of ways of communicating, secret ways of communicating, different taps on the wall, or things where they weren't as lonely, they would find out ways to communicate, or rules that say if you endure this much torture, then you're allowed to give up this information, but not until then, just to kind of give them um, milestones. And he said, but what about the ones you came up with all these things to help people um, successfully navigate this terrible situation of being a prisoner of war? And but what about the ones who didn't make it? And Admiral Stockdale said, that's easy. The ones who didn't make it were the optimists. He said the optimist, the blind optimist, would come in and they would go, "Oh, this is bad, but they're going to come and they're going to get us out of here by Christmas and everything's going to be fine." And Christmas would come and go and they were still there. And so the optimist would say, "Yeah, but we're only going to be here until Easter and then we'll be freed." And then Easter would come and go and they wouldn't be freed. And ultimately, they would just grow disappointed and die of a broken spirit. And he said, and he said, what it took to persevere was confronting the brutal facts of today while never losing faith that ultimately you will prevail. And so that mentality, having that culture of facing problems, facing the brutal facts, having a culture of surfacing those, while also having the resolve to say we will get through it, is a component of the Good to Great framework that all of the great companies had in mind or in common. And then the fourth component of the Good to Great framework was something called the hedgehog concept, which is fascinating to me. So the hedgehog concept was based on, I guess, a Greek parable of the fox and the hedgehog. And so the hedgehog is this weird little portly animal that really only was good at one thing, and that was balling up into a ball and defending itself. And so in the parable, apparently every day the fox would come up with some clever ploy to foil and catch the hedgehog, and the hedgehog would go along, not really the sharpest, not really the coolest kid on the block, but when the fox would spring its plan, the hedgehog did one thing: ball up, protect itself, and the plan would not work. So uh, it's kind of like when I was growing up, I loved watching the Looney Tunes with Wile E. Coyote, always trying to catch the Roadrunner. I always pulled for Wile E. Coyote. He was um, um, a hero of mine because the guy never quit. He would have plans, he would have all these cockamamie schemes, and he would order all these crazy things from Acme, whether it be tornado pills or a Batman suit or whatever. And he would always have every episode this new plan to catch the Roadrunner, and it always backfired on him, and the Roadrunner would always get free. And so it sounded a lot like the Fox and the Hedgehog concept. But the hedgehog concept was, what is the one thing that you're going to focus on? All the great companies had a hedgehog concept, which means they knew who they were. There's three parts to it. At what can you be the best in the world? About what are you passionate? And what drives your economic engine? And if you can find where all three of those intersect, then that's your hedgehog concept that you can bank on and know who you are and not get too far out of that. And so one of the examples that he used was Walgreens. And he talked about how Walgreens, one of their hedgehog concept revolved around convenience to the point that they insisted on building all the Walgreens on corner lots so that you had multiple options of how to get in and out of their parking lot. So you could have more options to go right. It was easier to get in and out if you were on a corner lot, to the point that if they had a Walgreens facility that was not on a corner lot and a corner lot came up, they would close the facility and open one on the corner lot next to it because that was so important to them. And then what drove their economic engine? Sales per customer. And so, like, per customer visit. And so that's where they would try to have all these convenient things for you that you didn't even know you wanted conveniently pop in front of you as you're waiting in line to check out and go, oh, I didn't know I needed another phone charger. I didn't know I was hungry for Reese's cups or whatever it may be. So, what is our hedgehog concept? How can we identify that? And how do we not compromise it by chasing business that may be outside of our lane? He said the great research said the great companies understood their hedgehog concept and stayed focused on it. And then a discipline of culture. A discipline of culture um, is not necessarily saying discipline of get onto people and punish them, but it's having your hedgehog concept, sticking to it, and it's just as important to have stop doing list. These are things we should stop doing because they're distracting to us, just as important as it is to have to-do lists. So it's really about focus. Understand who you are and stay focused on that. And then this one's really interesting, especially in today's world where we have all these waves of technologies hitting us. How great companies versus good companies handled the idea of technology, with the great companies viewing technology as an accelerator, not as the answer. So he said the good companies tended to invest in technology as a fix without understanding its benefits, whereas the great companies would try to improve the way they did things and invest in technology only to accelerate the improvements that they've already made. And so I work with a lot of companies over the years in manufacturing where they would invest in these new systems to run their business, ERP systems, enterprise resource planning, something like SAP or Oracle or things like that, all these magic information systems that will run your whole business for you that are all interrelated, and they always have issues. But what happens a lot of times is companies, instead of sitting down and specking out what we need a system to do and then going and shopping for that system, very often what happens is they will purchase a system as a fix. We just need a new system and without really understanding its capabilities, and then try to force fit what they do into that. So that's the difference in adopting technology just for the sake of it versus adopting it for the right reasons at a in very with a very intentional mindset. So the one of the big technologies now, right, is artificial intelligence, AI everything, AI this, AI that. And so um, very often we hear what role does AI play in this education? What role does AI play in manufacturing? How do we use some of that? And what I found out is very few people know what they're talking about, including myself, but they want it. Well, I'm not quite sure what this technology does, but I went golfing with my other CEO buddy, and he was telling me that they did it, so I need to get it too. Not quite sure what it is. Whereas the great companies would view it as we need a technology that performs this very intentional function, and only when we find a technology that does that will we adopt it. And then the seventh component was this concept of the flywheel versus the doom loop, which is going back to our laws of the fifth discipline. It kind of echoes one of those. Um, the power of gradual buildup or decline and the ability to understand that. So the flywheel says we're going to go in, we're going to take little steps forward, consistent with our hedgehog concept. Hopefully, we get some visible results. Based on those results, people will get energized, jump on board. That'll allow us to move forward even more, which leads to more results, which energizes people even more and keeps that going. Compared to what we talked about last week, we called that a reinforcing loop, right? We build on the energy and it just keeps growing with momentum. That's the flywheel. So he said the companies that were great understood that it didn't happen overnight. It was an accumulation of things that very often in the interviews that were conducted during the research, the people who worked for those organizations during this era of greatness didn't realize until later, upon reflection, that they were a part of something great. Because to them, on the inside, it was an accumulation of gradual things, whereas from the outside, people just saw the end result. So I think I've used the analogy before of an egg hatching. Whereas for those of us from the outside, if I watch an egg hatch, it's a pretty dramatic event. I see a crack and I see a chicken come out or whatever, a bird, and it's dramatic. Like, wow, the egg popped and something just came out of it. But on the inside of the egg, it's not dramatic. It's not this one big thing. It's gradual incubation and change that's happening that isn't visible from the outside. And so, um, the same thing can happen um, in the other direction, losing momentum. They call that the doom loop. So the flywheel, gradual momentum that just eventually keeps building up. Whereas the doom loop also says small negative things can start to, if I get disappointing results, I try something, I get disappointing results, I overreact by changing things without understanding what the disappointing results are. We'll adapt a new way of doing it. We don't have any buy-in. There's no buildup. Then we get more disappointing results and it compounds in the negative. So that's a negative reinforcing loop. And so the great companies understood gradual buildup and decline, whereas the good companies were looking for something more instantaneous. So that was the seven pieces of um, the good to great framework. So there were two on having disciplined people, which was level five leadership, and then the concept of first who, then where. getting the right people in the bus, getting them in the right seats before you decide where you're going. And then there was um, confronting the brutal facts and the hedgehog concept and disciplined thought. And then discipline action, which was a culture of discipline, and technology accelerators, all tied into the seventh component, the flywheel and the doom loop. And they said of those 11 companies out of the over 1,400 that were studied, 11 met the definition of greatness, and these seven things were something all 11 had in common. So maybe that's a mental model or framework for greatness that we can learn from. And so, what's interesting, several years later, Jim Collins, the author of Good to Great, was being invited to go speak to some military leaders because he had gotten famous with his book and he had had another book prior to that called Built to Last. And he was asked a question of what about companies that were great, but then fall because they weren't great forever? What makes companies go in the other direction? We have this framework for what greatness looks like. Do we have a framework or do we understand why companies fail? And so the follow-up book to Good to Great was called How the Mighty Fall, which was almost the inverse of Good to Great. But in the How the Mighty Fall, they identified a five-stage framework for decline, organizational decline. And it really doesn't even have to be organizational decline because when we start to talk about these five stages, you can actually start to see these in civilizations and societies, even beyond organizations. So, five stages of decline. So, what they did is they took a companies that were in Good to Great or the previous book Built to Last. And then, so at one point they had met that criteria, 15 cumulative years of stock return above uh, three times the average return, but then had a negative stock inflection during the 10 years of this study. And did those companies have anything in common? So they had the fallen company, and again, they had comparison companies. And what's really interesting is two of the decline companies were um, some of the ones that made the 11 list. And also, um, so we'll study those. So, five-stage framework for how the mighty fall. And this curve represents performance. And so what's scary, and he compares it to at the very beginning of the book, um, talking about his wife had been dealing with cancer, and he talks about the stages of cancer and how the earlier it's detected, the greater your chance of beating it. And he said it's the same thing for how the mighty fall. If you detect these stages of decline early, the chances you can correct are easier than if you detect them much later. But that's really tricky because performance is usually on the upswing sharply during the first two stages, and not until the end of stage three does it start to drop off. So it's hard to see if we're only looking at end result. So the first stage of decline is hubris or arrogance, pride. Hubris born of success. And that is developing that mentality that um, we are going to succeed because of who we are, not because of what we did to get where we are. In sports terms, it's the idea of thinking that you're going to win a game just because you put on a certain team's jersey, even though you don't follow the same standards and the same steps um, that made that team great to begin with. In the state of Alabama, Nick Saban at the University of Alabama had a successful run, about 17 years, won 6 championships, competed for many more, almost all years. He had something called the process, doing things the same way over and over and over again. He he would say things like, "Don't practice a technique until you can do it. Practice till you don't get it wrong. Don't practice till you get it right. Practice till you can't get it wrong." And but just because a team had success during one era doesn't mean when someone else is there and they stop doing the same things that they're going to continue to have success. Um, and so hubris fails to understand what you did to get to a level of success and thinks that you will just continue to succeed because of who the organization is. And so if we can start to detect that that exists, that's the first signs that there's problems. Then stage two is an undisciplined pursuit of more, confusing more, getting numbers with growth, which is sustainable expansion to scale. So very often the companies that declined would pursue more without understanding the infrastructure that was needed, the personnel that was needed, the skills that were needed to support having more. We saw this in our engineering management graduate program um, over the years. We finally have been able to hire more faculty, but when we resurrected the program back in 2019, our Department of Industrial and Systems Engineering and Engineering Management had 8 faculty, and I was the only full-time faculty for engineering management. And then we started gradually getting, especially at the PhD level, students enrolled in the PhD, but not equipping the faculty to support that discipline. So then, um, 2 years ago, I believe we had 56 PhD students, and 40 of them were engineering management faculty. So a high percentage, 80% of the PhDs were faculty. I was still the only full-time engineering management faculty. Um, out of so 1/8 of the faculty was there, even though the PhD population was 80% engineering management. And so growing numbers without being able to sustain it um, creates a lot of strain on the system, and you shouldn't expect just to be able to click in the corner of the picture and drag and it grow to scale without um, being able to support that. And so the companies who pursued more without understanding what it took to sustain more tended to decline. And then stage three is denial of risk or denial of danger or peril. So again, in stage three, and only toward the end of stage three, is they're starting to show decline in actual performance. And that's when it's first detected the easiest. But if we can detect it at the first 2 stages, maybe we can correct course with less effort. But then it's hard to deny that there's problems at the end of stage three when we're actually seeing drop off in performance. So denial of risk and peril very often involves blaming on the outside. Oh, things are going bad, but it's because of the economy or the recession, or executives have become detached and don't realize reality and what's really going on. And so they just ignore the threats, even though they're popping up all around them. Um, it kind of reminds me of in, I believe it was 2003, when the United States invaded Iraq. And in Baghdad, there were flames and the city was falling and statues were toppling. And then the Iraqi minister of communication would go on TV and be like, "No, everything's fine, nothing's happening." As you could see smoke and statues toppling behind him, it's kind of like denial of risk, denial of peril, even though it's obvious that it's happening. So kind of ignoring the obvious signs. And then the fourth stage is grasping for salvation. So now I know things are going bad and I'm just trying to find a quick fix. This is when a lot of companies would bring in those level four leaders. Here I come to save the day. They'll bring in a leader as a savior, even though they're already strongly on the downslide. Or like my whole the early part of my engineering career was helping companies implement lean systems. And in the 2000s, the 2010s, like lean was very popular and companies wanted to implement it and Six Sigma because they viewed them as silver bullets, things that would help. Hey, we just need to come in and we need to do that. Companies view AI like that now. But they're grasping for salvation when they don't realize why they need it. They just know that results are starting to drop off and they're panicking and desperate to try anything that might reverse course. And then stage five is the final stage of decline, which is capitulation to irrelevance or death. So the company either ceases to exist anymore, can't reverse course at that point, or even if it does exist, it becomes such a small organization, or they have to sell out, or they just are operating at such a small scale that they are no longer, they're only a shadow of what they were. So they either have to give up or they struggle and run at a small, insignificant scale. So the point of How the Mighty Fall was if we can introduce this framework, this mental model for organizational decline to where we can understand it, we also have to realize the earlier that we can detect this evidence, now that I have this framework that tells me this is one of the signs of decline, if I can detect it earlier, the less effort it will take me to correct course. It can be reversed before stage five. It just becomes harder. So I found that um, so we talked about mental models from the fifth discipline tonight. But then I introduced three different books and mental models that they present. So when you win is something that we're actually going to be using a good bit for the rest of the semester. And so he introduced the mental model for effective management, the big three, which leads to engagement, which leads to results. So we discussed that a little bit. We'll go into that a lot more. But I also wanted to share because one of the things when we jump into module two that we're going to discuss is competitive strategy and competitiveness and strategy. I think the Good to Great framework is a mental model, and then How the Mighty Fall presents us that five-stage um, model of decline. That the better we can understand that, hopefully, the greater the chances we can make better decisions in our organization. So I wanted to hit on those tonight. Um, as we were discussing mental models. So went through a lot. Um, what do y'all have to say? Y'all have any questions or comments or anything? Well, good luck. Good luck on your exam next week. Um, be working on your projects. I hope let yourself have fun with it. This can be a really cool, fun project. Once you get into it, you should be working on this consistently. Like I said, I don't give homework. I don't give anything. This project's a big part of your grade, so I expect a lot of effort out of it. Um, I hope y'all enjoy doing it, and hope you have a good weekend. If you're here locally, I hope you stay warm, and I will see you next week. Good night.